It's Allison from the Law School Toolbox. Thanks for joining us. Today, we're excited to have ex-BigLaw recruiter Sadie Jones here with us to talk about showing appropriate interest in a job interview. Welcome, Sadie.
Thanks for having me back.
My pleasure. Well, this one I think can go wrong in both directions. Too much and too little. Do you agree with that?
I definitely agree. And I think depending on kind of the type of person you are, then you can definitely go in one direction or the other. So I think it's kind of individual.
Right. I mean, what do you think is sort of an appropriate level? Like, what are employers and interviewers generally looking for here in terms of interest?
Well, I think you want to try to customize everything to the individual employer so it doesn't look like you just wrote 100 different resumes that were exactly the same, 100 different cover letters that were exactly the same to any law firm that exists in any location. So I think you want it to sound a little bit like you're writing it to them. You know who they are. You know where they are. You want to make sure that you generally have the qualifications. That being said, I always say, if they have a GPA cutoff and you're close, I don't think that means you don't apply. But you want to kind of fit generally what they're looking for. You want to know where they are, what their practice areas are, all of that kind of stuff. You want to make sure that it fits. It doesn't need to be perfect. You don't have to have every single thing they ask for or, have it be your dream position. And this is the only place that you think that you can work. Because I think that is where people do go too far. This is a dream come true for me. It just doesn't sound very real. So I think you don't have to be perfect. You just want to be a fit and have it make sense to move forward with them.
I agree. I mean, I think it's important to do that baseline of, am I basically qualified for this? Am I more or less what they're looking for? Do I even understand what this job is? Is it in a location I'm basically interested in? And I agree, you can't just apply willy-nilly and send out 100 resumes and 1,000 resumes and just be like scattershot, maybe something will stick. I don't think that's necessarily the way to go about this. But like you said, it doesn't have to be, your most perfect, ideal dream job. You don't have to be the perfect candidate. And I think, too, it's not necessary that you know everything about the people and the job if you do get an interview. And it's not necessary, really, that you make yourself out to be the single most perfect candidate ever. I think sometimes people, maybe it's just because they're in law school and they tend to be type A overachievers, they think they have to be the most perfect candidate and they have to really sell themselves and be the one who stands out from everybody else. And I honestly just don't know that that is what firms and other employers are necessarily really looking for here. Do you?
I also just think that kind of thinking is going to lead to mistakes because it's very unlikely that you are the perfect candidate.
Right.
And so I think you're going to try to fit yourself into this box that you don't fit into exactly perfectly. And so you're kind of spending the whole time trying to figure out what are each individual things I'm supposed to say to make sure that it fits what I think they want. And I just think that's never going to work. And you're going to say something that you don't really know. You also don't know what they're looking for exactly. That's the other thing. When you're spending so much time trying to figure out what they want, I think there's just no way to do that. So you need to make it honest and real to some extent, not just exactly what you think that they're looking for and then check all these boxes.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I think of it almost like dating, at some point, if you pretend to be somebody you're not because you think somebody else wants you to be that thing, and then, okay, they agree to go out with you, but then you're in a relationship with somebody pretending to be fake. It's just not a long-term option, really, to a successful relationship is to try to pretend to be something that you're not really because you think that's what somebody else wants. It's just all very complicated, I feel like.
Because you have to think ahead. What if you get the job and you've committed to all these things that aren't true in order to get the job? And maybe because you were desperate, or you felt like this was the best option. Like you said, eventually it will come out. And so I don't think it's good. So I think that you want to be a fit in the same way that they want to find a fit. So it shouldn't just be anything.
Yeah, I agree. And I think also, let's be honest, particularly at law firms, I think in some ways they're looking for the good enough candidates. They're not looking for the perfect candidate. I think just people want to stand out in some ways. They want to be so much better than everybody else. It's well, everybody else is great. Maybe you're great too. You can have a whole summer class of people who are really great. And none of them have to be like the standout, most impressive person ever.
And who's to even say what that is? Like, not everyone is looking for the same thing. And I've seen, lawyers interview the same candidate and have really different reactions to them because, oh, well, this is important to me and it's not important to the other person. And that's generally why you're going to meet with multiple people if you go for a full round so that different people can see you. So I think it's better to be yourself as much as you can. You want to know who they are and make sure that it seems like generally it would be a fit. But I agree with you. Also, they don't want every candidate to be the same. That doesn't make for a very interesting workplace. I think that there's room for different people at most places.
I think that's right. So basically, we're giving people permission here to kind of relax. Try to be yourself. Like, you are very impressive, or you wouldn't be interviewing these places that you have interviews. At that point, they're definitely considering you. You've crossed the threshold into someone that they might be willing to make an offer to. So I think it's a balance like everything else. You need to do that research and that kind of pre-thinking so that you can show up and say, this is like a good fit. Like, it's something I'm interested in, but you can't go too overboard. So what kind of research do you think people should be doing either before they apply or once they have an interview?
Well, I think, like we said, you should know, where they have offices, are they international or they're just a boutique, how big the offices are. If they have any big cases going on, you want to know what areas of law they practice. Generally, I don't think you need to know every single thing they do and understand every single practice group, but you definitely don't want to reference an office they don't have, or, they recently went through a merger and you didn't know about it. So you just want to kind of be familiar with who they are, kind of what their practice area is, anything super important about them. But I don't think you need to be like a groupie for the particular law firm or person or interviewer or anything like that.
Yeah, for example, the place that I worked did not do corporate work, which is fairly unusual. They only did litigation, and there were specific reasons for that. But if somebody showed up and talked to me about like, oh, well, I'm interested in corporate or litigation work, it's sort of like, this might not be the right firm for you. Do you have any idea like what we actually practice? So something like basic like that, definitely you want to know, particularly if it's something unusual, which that is pretty unusual in the world of big law.
I totally agree. Or I definitely had people try to apply to an office, at a firm that I was at where we didn't have an office there. I'm like, sorry, unfortunately, that's not a possibility. And then they try to immediately backtrack. Oh, no. I also want to work in New York. Right. And it's like, well, that doesn't sound exactly that genuine anymore because you just said that you wanted to work in Denver. So.
Right. Yeah, I know I had one notorious interview at OCI where I accidentally had applied to the DC office, and the interview was going pretty well until they asked me why DC, and I sort of looked at them blankly and was like, DC? And they're like, you do realize you're applying for the DC office of our firm? And I'm like, oh, right. Well, yeah. Suffice it to say, I didn't get a call back.
And that was probably for the best. Like, you shouldn't have just
good.
made it up and said that, oh, no, it turns out you really want to work in DC.
No, I just thought I'd apply to New York and apparently checked the wrong box. So these things do happen, but that was an example of not being a good fit and not showing the appropriate level of interest because I literally didn't know where I was applying.
So I think you should know the basics, but I don't think you're expected to know every single thing about the firm. If there's something like a program they have or a certain kind of work they do, that you are very interested in or uniquely interested in, I think it's great to reference that. So I think that's totally fine. But I have noticed sometimes candidates will try to like memorize the whole website, and it sounds really fake reading it back, like that you can just spew out all these facts, like where they are on every list or something. I don't think that's necessarily helpful.
Right. And I do think if they're known for a practice area, and you do have a real interest in it and you can back that up, that's great. But if you go in to an interview because you're like, oh, this firm's known for bankruptcy work, and you start talking about how much you want to do bankruptcy, and then they realize you have no interest in corporate anything and you don't know anything about bankruptcy and you're not planning on taking any classes, that also does not end up being a good look usually.
Totally. I also think that candidates don't realize that not every interviewer is meant for you. Like somebody didn't put together necessarily the perfect list of people that do exactly what they think you want to do. Sometimes they just needed to fill a spot, or especially with like a screen interview. Yes, you may be interested in corporate and they may have corporate, but you're talking to a litigator. You don't need to make something up about how you really want to be a litigator. They know that they will be interviewing people who also want to do corporate, and the interviewer can handle that. You don't need to fit this box of like, well, but I also would do exactly what you want to do. That doesn't sound right. And I think people do that a lot.
Yeah, I think it's just sort of, you want to be like similar to the person you're interviewing with. People just kind of fall into it. Oh, well, I'm also interested in that. And they're like, wait a second. A second ago, you told me you were only interested in corporate. And now you're like, oh, but I could do what you do. What is it you do again? Tell me more. I could do that.
Exactly.
It just ends up being a little weird.
Exactly. So I think it's fine to ask them. Sometimes if they do something that you don't really know that much about, that might be a question that you can ask in the question time. But I don't think that you should make up a backstory about how it turns out you really want to do tax because you found out that they were tax.
Right. I once worked at a place where they had one of the leading practitioners on ERISA, which is like a retirement plan. And this guy was really into it and he really loved it and he really loved to talk about it. And this was when I was a summer. So it wasn't like I had to be in an interview with him. But, if you were willing to talk to him about it and at lunch, he loved you. So in an interview, if you find out you're interviewing with somebody who's an ERISA attorney, I think it's totally fair to be like, oh, that sounds pretty interesting. What do you like about that practice area? And just let him talk about it. But you don't have to then pretend that you want to do it too.
Exactly. I think that there is a way to have a nice discussion and make the interviewer feel good about what they do without making up a story about how it's what you want to do.
Right. Or now that you've heard about it, you're totally willing to go and work for him every day about ERISA. I mean, maybe you are. Maybe you're like, this is life-changing. But most likely not.
I think it just comes across as desperate, which usually that is where it's coming from. Like you want a job.
Yeah, I think it's a fine line. You like show interest and you're open without molding yourself into something that you absolutely are not, to pretend that you would be happy doing this when the person probably doesn't expect that, may not even have a spot because it's like really specialized, and actually might decrease your chances versus just saying you want to do general litigation where they probably have a million spots compared to like their ERISA slot. So I don't know, I think interest is great in terms of like, I'd love to learn more about this, but you don't have to pretend to do it.
And I always tell summers they should try different assignments. So I totally agree. It's okay to say, oh, I think I want to do litigation, but I would be open to trying a corporate assignment. I always think that's a nice thing to say or something like that. It's important to learn what other practice groups do because you're going to be working together. Sound like you're interested in teamwork, that kind of thing.
Right.
But you don't need to like tie yourself into knots to figure out how to be the person that you've decided that they're looking for when you don't even know.
Right. Because the reality is if you are, say you're in corporate and then the economy turns and they need people to do bankruptcy while you're working there, somebody's probably going to come to you and say, hey, we realize this would be a shift, but is this something you're willing to do to keep your job? And at that point, you can decide.
Totally. And sometimes you don't know, and that's also okay too. I want to try different things. You don't need to be committed to something again because you think that's what you're supposed to say. You've probably had 1 year of law school and you may not know, and that's also okay. You can be flexible.
Right. So I think that's too a balance. Like it's fine to be open to things, but you don't want to just be like shape-shifting to fit whatever you think somebody might want you to fit into. Well, let's shift gears a little bit. To what extent do you think you should spend time researching the interviewer if you've been given a name before your interviews? Like how deep should people go on this?
I think that if you've been given a name, it's a good idea to look them up and have an idea of who they are, with the caveat that you don't know if that person's actually going to interview you. At the last minute, things change. And again, don't get so attached to it that you're doing what we already talked about, which was kind of shape-shifting into what you've decided this person wants. So I would limit it to 10 minutes, maybe, looking them up. Only look up things that are like on their work bio or maybe LinkedIn, or I guess if they were in the news or something for a case, something like that. But don't go into their social media. Don't even find out about things that you might be tempted to talk about that are personal that, have nothing to do with their work stuff. You could just end up saying something that's too much and crosses a line. And I also just think if you get too attached to everything about the person that's going to interview you and then it changes, it can really throw you off. and you have trouble adjusting to, oh, it's a different person completely in a different practice group.
Right. And that definitely can happen. I mean, when I was at a firm, I certainly had situations where the head of HR would come in and say, hey, I need you to do an interview in 20 minutes. Somebody's stuck in court. Like, can you do that? I'm like, okay, cool. Do I even get a resume beforehand?
Yeah.
Sometimes the answer was no, sorry, just roll with it. So yeah, I mean, I think you can't get too hung up on any one person, but I do agree, you want to at least know, okay, you've looked at their bio on the website, you know where they went to school, you know like what general practice area they're involved in, it might list some cases, because that's going to help you with your questions at the end a little bit. But again, like you don't have to show that. Now, I think people want to show off, basically. They want to show that they looked at the website. They want to show that they know that somebody's working on this case. And I just really never liked that.
And I just think it really comes across as fake. And I've heard students talk about, they think they're like gaming the system. Like, oh, well, I've researched all this stuff about them. And so I know what they're going to be looking for, and so I'm going to say these 3 things because I know that will resonate with them or something. And it just doesn't. They're interviewing probably a bunch of people that day. You just want to be yourself, like come across as interesting because, you're talking about things you care about, not things you've decided that they care about. So I think you just need to be careful in terms of the type of research you do, the extent of research you do, and again, like how attached you are to it. Also, if they've been switched out at the last minute, they know that. So they know that you didn't know that they were interviewing you and they don't expect anything. And they probably will come in and say, oh, I got switched out. I work in the corporate department or whatever. They'll give you some background.
Yeah. I mean, if that happened to me, I'd always like hand the person my card so like they knew who I was and say, hey, I know this is a last minute switch, like so-and-so stuck in court. I'm a patent litigator and I'm going to be talking with you today. Like, let's get started.
Yeah. And so I think it's really important to be able to roll with that kind of thing. And so just getting too attached to the story that you've cooked up ahead of time, I just think will backfire.
I agree. And I definitely had people sometimes who had like clearly done a lot of research and it was just kind of creepy. I mean, people found stuff that like I had not thought about for many, many years on the internet. And I was just like, what? How did you even find that? This is weird. Like getting a stalker vibe here. I don't like this. I don't know. I think you have to be careful.
That's why I think it's better not to look at any kind of, even if you're Googling them, if stuff comes up that looks like it's personal, just don't even look at it. So you haven't seen it. It's not in your head.
I remember like before when I started therapy, they like gave me the person's name and I like Googled, of course, and found like this whole article about like how she met her husband and how they met on a train in Europe. And I went into the first meeting and like I know all this stuff about her. And I was just like, this is just weird. Like, why did I do this?
And you can't unknow it, is
right.
The thing. That's why I think it's better not to look.
Yeah, I agree. Like, I think know the basics, be prepared, but also nobody's going to quiz you on like, do you know what I do? It's like, no one would ever do that.
Exactly.
Like, don't you know who I am? I mean, if they did, that would be crazy.
Well, and that should be a turnoff to you if that's kind of their reaction. Remember, you're also evaluating if you are interested in them. You don't want them to just be interested in you. It's a two-way street.
And I mean, also, like, obviously, if you're interviewing with a name partner of the firm, like, you should know who that person is. But, like, you don't have to know everything about them. You have to know, like, oh, yes, you're Mr. So-and-so who is on the masthead of the law firm.
Yeah.
And they're probably not interviewing you anyway because they're busy.
I was going to say, there's very few people who are doing interviews that are like celebrity lawyers.
Right.
So they're not going to be like, do you know who I am?
Right. Don't you know, like, what case I'm working on? I mean, lawyers are egotistical, but probably they do understand that, like, they're not that important.
Yeah, most of the time.
All right. Well, before we wrap up, let's talk about kind of where you can explain or present your interest in a way that is not going to be off-putting. What are the options here?
So first, you're going to have kind of your documents. Your cover letter is obviously, the place where you can most explain it before there's any interview situation. Although your resume also could show your interest because maybe you've tailored it and maybe it's specific to, this area of law you're applying to or whatever. So I think your cover letter, I do think like cover letters need to be fairly short too. And so they can explain things a little more than your resume, but it should not be a 2-page cover letter that, again, explains why this is the absolute dream job for you. And you grew up always knowing that you wanted to work there. And you have done everything your entire life to end up in this position. Like, first of all, they're not going to read it. And second of all, it's not going to get you anything. It's, again, going to be creepy. So I just think like this is all within reason. I also think if it's a place that you particularly want to work, I do recommend potentially networking ahead of time. I don't think that everyone has time to talk to somebody at every firm they're applying to. But let's say that there's 5 firms you're most interested in. I think it's a good idea to maybe see if there's any alumni or a specific practice group or you know someone. So that's another place and they could put in a good word for you, which is always nice. Do not go overboard there. Don't call 10 different people and have them all call the recruiter. That is a bad look. And I've definitely seen it. And it's a real turn off. And then obviously, in the interview, you're going to express your interests. They are probably going to ask you directly, why do you want to work here? So do not be surprised at that question. There does not need to be a super unique answer to this either. You are not going to be groundbreaking in the reason you want to work there and come up with some answer that no law student has ever given them. So I think do not overthink this question. You should have an answer. It should be, a good answer. Like they have things that you want to do. They're in a location you want to be. They're in an office size you want to be. There's lots of reasons you could want to work there. So it might be very specific. It might be kind of general. I just think that this is a question that you can mess up like we've talked about either way, which is like you're completely unprepared for it and have no answer, which I've seen, which like if you have no answer to that, you're definitely not, getting an offer to work there. But also, I don't think that you should have such a specific answer or try to be really creative with this or anything.
Right. And I think to some extent, this depends on the position. I mean, if you're going for like a big law position where you're going to go into general litigation, this can be a much more general answer of like, oh, I really enjoyed my civil procedure class and I'm interested in being in court or whatever. Although even that one's a little bit iffy because most people don't go to court, but, you may not know that at this point. So they might cut you a little slack on that. But, if you're applying for like a very specific type of job at like a public interest organization or something, this question is going to be really, really important because they do need a solid answer for why you want to do this. So you can also gauge your response depending on the role that you're actually applying for and how much specificity is probably required for it.
Or let's say that you want to be a corporate lawyer, but that's not your background, like you haven't had that specific work. This is a question where you can shine and you could have done it in your cover letter first, but you should be prepared to explain, why you're interested in corporate work. And I'm using that example because obviously law school is geared towards litigation. And so if you say you want to do corporate work, you should have an answer or have taken certain classes or there's like a reason. And I don't think you need to have work experience in it. You just need to explain why you're interested and have it sound really coherent.
Right, because I understand that unless you were in like investment banking or something before law school, you probably don't have a lot of experience in the corporate world. But you do need to be able to present some sort of logical story about why this makes sense for you. And it could even be like, well, I really enjoyed some of the more corporate focused 1L classes. And I'm looking forward this year to taking X, Y, and Z. I mean, that's really good enough.
Absolutely. And so this, I think, is a great place for asking them a question, when it comes to question time. What do they suggest? Because law school is more litigation focused, are there certain classes they think are, really important or helpful to someone, with a corporate leaning, that kind of thing?
Right. And you can also, I think another good question to ask to show your interest is sort of, well, how did they get into this? What was their background? Like, how do they like the working in corporate law? Like all of these type of things are pretty softball questions, which is what I think you ought to be going for at the end, not something that's going to put them on the spot and make them like really have to think, but something that anyone should be able to talk about for 30 to 60 seconds pretty easily.
Also, listen to their answer. They might say something that will actually be helpful here.
Yeah, exactly. So. It's not just a question to ask to like check off the box. And I think that's really important when you are in that kind of question time. What questions do you have for me is to really to listen to the answer and to follow up on it, because that is one of the key things that really shows you're interested. So if I'm saying, oh, I do patent litigation and I'm working on a case in Delaware and I don't say much else about it, it's totally fine and actually awesome to say, oh, what is the Delaware case about? What's your role there? Like, how is that going? Like, all of these things make it clear that you're actually paying attention.
And when we talk about interest, to me, that's like interest in the moment, like interest in the person you're talking to, interest in this conversation. But if you're so stuck on, well, I had my list and I
my next question. What's my next question?
And I think people do get really stuck in that. And that's totally normal. And that's why you should practice this kind of thing. And maybe practice with somebody asking you, a question you weren't prepared for and listening to the answer and asking a follow-up. So I think, that's where you need to be in the moment. And it's okay if you didn't say the 3 questions you had planned to say and you said 3 different ones.
Right. I mean, you've got, your 3 to 5 questions ready in case you need to fill time. If you don't need to fill time, that's great. That means you're having like a conversation about things. So I don't think people necessarily have to feel like they need to ask all 5 questions just because they came up with them. If things are going well and you're at the end of the interview, totally great to be like, so nice to meet you.
And I think that the interviewer is going to go away feeling better about how it went and if you had a real conversation that they enjoyed, then that they, learned that you're the absolute perfect fit for their practice group, which they won't think, no matter what you
and honestly,
say.
like when you find people who are like trying so hard to show you that, it's just like, God, this person is going to be a nightmare to work with. I don't want to deal with them.
Yeah, you can kind of tell the type of person that they're going to be. So I think you want to come across as just somebody they would enjoy working with, someone they had a nice conversation with, versus, that you got all these talking points in or that kind of thing.
Yeah. And, like we said, I think basic research, but when people go overboard, I think it's just trying to control the situation, like maybe some insecurity. And you've really just got to like back off on that and try to make this a little bit more natural experience, try to be yourself and just kind of roll with it. Because frankly, that's what lawyers kind of do most of the day is like things come up and you roll with it.
So that's the kind of thing you can demonstrate in the interview that I think they're looking for. Like sometimes I think that students think there's a right answer to the question and there isn't. They actually want to see like how you handle the question. And it's not so much about what the answer was.
No, and sometimes people will, and these people are often notorious within a firm, will always ask like a very pointed question that they're trying to rattle you or upset you or like whatever it is. I mean, do I think that is the best interviewing technique? No, but do these people exist? Absolutely. And so, if they ask you like, well, what about this one bad grade? Like, doesn't that show that, you shouldn't be a litigator? They don't really think that. They're just trying to see what your response is going to be. If you're going to like bust out crying or start fighting with them or just like own it and move on.
Or blame the professor, or say, oh, it was everyone else's fault or something.
Yeah. I mean, if somebody asks like a really pointed question, they're probably notorious for doing that. And, again, like you just kind of got to roll with it.
And if they're just a jerk, so what? Move on.
Like they're definitely like jerky lawyers out there.
Yeah, I agree.
No question.
And also, you should know that if you've had 5 interviews and they're all like that, okay, maybe that's the kind of place it is.
Right, exactly. Maybe you're like, ooh, I do not think I want to deal with these people on an ongoing basis.
Exactly.
And that's part of the value of interviewing.
Yeah.
All right, we're about out of time now. Any final thoughts on this?
My final thought really is that you should try to be yourself as much as you can. And I know that is harder to do, in the interview scenario. But I really think that a mistake that you make by being yourself is not going to be as bad as trying to be this like robot person that's saying all the exact right things. I think that saying the wrong thing or whatever you think the wrong thing is, but being more comfortable is a better situation in the end. And also, there is no right answer. There is no way to control this. There is no way to say all the things and make sure that you get a job offer. So you just need to kind of be genuine and hope that it's a fit on both ends for you and for them.
Right. And the other thing that made me think of is people may not realize, but, your interviewer is obviously going to be asked to evaluate you afterwards. And so if you've told like 4 different people totally different things, that's probably going to get back to the HR person who's going to be compiling all of these and being like, wait, They told you they want to be a litigator, and they told you they want to be in corporate, and they told you they want to do like tax. What? This doesn't make any sense.
That has 100% happened because it all gets put together a lot of times in sort of like a booklet. And so, especially when you read it all together, it comes across as very weird.
Yeah, you got to definitely be consistent because people will talk basically, or like talk on, an evaluation. Like all this stuff will be recorded. So just be aware of that.
Good point.
All right. Well, thank you for joining us. With that, we are unfortunately out of time.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for joining us. You can check out lawschooltoolbox.com or careerdicta.com for more help with your job interviews. Please subscribe. Thanks. Bye.